Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission Podcast. My name is Rebecca Twomey, and I'm here with my lovely co-host and sister, Rachel Smith.
Hey.
We're on a mission to encourage and inspire others as they navigate through this life and their relationship with Christ. Last week, we talked about the biblical use of the word Pharmakeia and its use in reference to sorcery and witchcraft. Fun topics. And then we discussed how this world evolved and it's used to describe the pharmaceutical industry today. After wrapping last week's episode, we really felt like there was a lot more to talk about. There was a lot more we wanted to touch on. And we did have a guest scheduled to come talk on this topic, but unfortunately, there have been some scheduling conflicts that have prevented us from getting a chance to record with her. So today we're going to dive into a couple of things, and some of this we did learn from her. And so I want to make sure to give her credit on some of the things that she kind of brought to light for me personally. I know Rachel was kind of already on this track, but I had some good conversations. So you can find Casey Byram on Instagram at _Byram_boys. She's an RN, so she's been working in the medical industry for quite some time and has had her eyes opened about a lot of things. And she loves to share truths on her page and what she's discovered working in medicine. So definitely go follow her. She's a great resource. And hopefully we're going to get her on the show to talk about this topic. But until then, we wanted to make sure that we continue to talk about and really dive deeper into Pharmakeia, the word, the roots, and all this stuff, because the whole point is education, right, Ray? We're here to discuss. We're not here, first of all, this isn't medical advice. Nothing that we're saying ever is medical advice, but I always have to give that warning. You know, a lot of what we're finding and what we're coming to might even come across as opinion, and some of it is, and that's okay. But more than anything, you know, we just feel convicted to share what we're learning because we know how important it is as we're entering these end times. And as deception is more and more prevalent in the end of times, as the birth pains are getting closer, I think it sticks close to my heart that I don't want anyone to be deceived. And when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, there are many deceptions that are taking place. And again, some of this is my opinion, but some of this is what I've discovered in researching different aspects of the medical industry. And so there's a lot of truth here too, guys. And anyway, the whole goal here is that we want you to be thinking about it too, praying about it, asking the Lord to guide you and show you and convict you and open your eyes and heart to his way and what is right. So that's our big goal. We are going to have a guest shortly in a couple of weeks. His name is Dr. Vaughn, and he talks about a lot of this stuff. He's going to talk about a lot of this stuff in those episodes about partnering with God for our health and a really Yahweh-centered approach to healthful living. I think that's going to be really helpful if you're interested in this mini-series on health. Definitely keep listening through. This is kind of the background that's going to bring us to today and what we can do with our bodies and our lives today. So, all that said, today is about Pharmakeia, and we're going to hone in specifically on its roots in Greek mythology, the Nephilim, and symbolism. And this is going to tie us to how Western medicine got to where it is today. And we'll keep going from there. So,
yeah, sounds great. I think we touched on some of these things a little bit the last episode. Actually, interestingly enough, the last episode we did on Pharmakeia that we recorded, you know, we mentioned a little bit of these things. And then the very next day, I saw Casey talking about the same exact thing on her Instagram stories. And that's what kind of really sparked you and I of like, we need to go into this even deeper
We need
because
to go deeper down the rabbit hole. We
yeah,
were
we were
too
scratching the surface. So now we're
exactly.
like, let's make this a 6-part series.
I mean, and it could be. That's the thing with health is and this idea of pharmacy and pharmaceuticals and all that good stuff is it literally could be 20 episodes.
Yeah.
Or it could be a whole podcast. It could be our whole podcast, but I don't think
Well, some people do have it as their whole podcast. Well,
so.
like Del Bigtree's The High Wire, like that's
Yeah.
pretty
Well,
popular.
the high wire I find kind of exciting, but
Yeah, he's pretty exciting, but he can be kind of like sensational, like
yeah, yeah, that's true. He has some good stuff, but it's the kind of thing,
he brings on good guests, really.
you're not always going to be tuning in necessarily all the time because when you're living in that, what is the word for it? You would probably know better than me because I feel like it impacts you a lot, like mentally and physically, when you're constantly being berated with negative
Mm,
type of content.
yes. Yeah.
And it's not to say that Del Bigtree is not negative. He's revealing a lot of truth,
But he
but
like
it's
only
so
talks about
heavy.
negative things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
you can't always be listening to the heavy stuff all the time.
Yeah. I am sensitive to that if I get surrounded by that too much, it starts to just consume me too much.
All right, so let's jump into symbolism because something that we did not address last week was the symbolism of pharmakeia that's presented to us even today in the medical world. There is a
Mhm.
there are many symbols used for medicine and they all have the same insignia, but the most popular symbol used in medicine today is called the caduceus. And all of us have seen this because, again, it's all over the place. It is a staff with snakes coiled around it. And it's the official insignia of the United States Medical Corps, the Navy Pharmacy Division, and the Public Health Service. The caduceus is also the magic wand carried by Hermes, and the Romans knew him as Mercury, the messenger of the gods. So, if you want to know more about this, you can find out about this by simply Googling. I am not sharing anything that is you actually have to dig to find.
Yeah.
It's common knowledge that this symbol comes from Greek mythology. And actually, in an article the Mayo Clinic put out, they break down the roots of the emblem that is all about mythology. And the most standout part of this article, I had to share this in this episode today because it really stood out to me. So here's what it says in the article. To understand the association of the winged caduceus and the healing arts, one must consider two early forms of worship: adoration of serpents and of the sun. Serpent and sun worship are found to be universally associated. The serpent was worshipped as a symbol of life and regenerative power by primitive humans who also associated sunshine with the blessings of life and health. The establishment of the seat of serpent worship in northern Egypt in the dominion of the sun god Ra led to the association of the sun and the serpent. So this
Wow.
is mayoclinic.com article explaining the caduceus. And as a Christian, when I read that, it gave me the heebie jeebies.
You know what that reminded me of is people consider him controversial, but are you familiar with Graham Hancock?
Mm-mm.
So, Graham Hancock is a journalist, but he's taken up his career for the past 20 or 30 years, essentially covering ancient archaeology. And so Egyptologists, a lot of mainstream Egyptologists and archaeologists really hate him because he has developed in putting puzzle pieces together from all kinds of different historical sites and evidence all over the world, a idea that advanced civilizations are older than mainstream history has told us they are.
Mm-hmm.
So in the past few months, I know you don't have Netflix, but it's been very popular and his name has been more popular. He's been on like the Joe Rogan podcast multiple times
Okay.
and stuff.
Okay.
But he just came out with a documentary on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched the whole thing. And while there's some things that, there's nobody that I think I would ever agree with 100%, he's coming from a secular worldview
Okay.
and arguing of a global catastrophe, most likely a global flood that happened about 10,000 years ago. And
Okay.
he travels all over the world at different sites, like pulling from their archaeological evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
But one common thread he notes in every single archaeological site is the depiction of serpents,
Mm-hmm.
going as far back as the most ancient archaeological temple worship sites. I'm pretty sure it was in Turkey, and they're dating it now to be almost 15,000 years old, which is older than anything that they've ever thought that humans could build, because this mainstream history puts humans at, like, hunters and gatherers at the time, not people who could build
Mm-hmm.
very advanced sites.
Mm-hmm.
But there are serpents, and they're specifically oriented with the rising sun on a specific day.
Mm-hmm.
So the one that comes to my mind that really changed his career is, I might pronounce it wrong, but Gigliotepe, I believe it is. And this is in Turkey, I'm pretty sure. And then only like 30 miles away is another site that they believe might even be older. And it had this whole, and they believe it was a religious site, and it had all of these really disturbing looking phallic massive pillars
Mm-hmm.
all over, like dozens of them. And in the center is this creepy humanoid snake face.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it was either the summer solstice or the winter solstice, I'm going off my memory of watching this documentary one time, the sun shines right through the serpent's mouth.
Hmm.
So he notates that
Interesting.
this type of serpent and sun worship
Yeah.
is also in sites in China and Mexico and Brazil
Mm-hmm.
and islands and the Middle East. It's everywhere. And these people, you know, how would they have had any communication with each other?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking 10,000 plus years ago. So I just couldn't help but think about that when you're reading this from the Mayo Clinic website about what was it called? The caduceus, the symbol,
Yeah.
is that they're only dating it to Egyptians,
Mm-hmm.
but this really is as old as time, just like,
Well, sure. They mention the Egyptians, but
yeah,
I believe Greek mythology. And when we get into that, it is going to date us to pre-flood,
yeah,
because that's going to date us to the Nephilim, which is
right,
interesting part of this conversation. Something I do want to note about, just a reminder about anything to do with science, this is my own personal opinion, is that anything that we ever hear about dating, we just have to be super duper, I don't know what the word is, questioning,
skeptical,
skeptical,
yeah,
because the truth is that we don't know, and we never
yeah,
will know when it comes to the dates of things. We talked when we talked about the calendar, we know our calendars have been
yeah,
changed and stuff like that. But I think if anybody ever was familiar with Kent Hovind, who was a Christian scientist, that was one of the
He's a Christian who's a scientist. If you say Christian scientist, that's like its own
like
religion.
Scientology.
Yeah.
He is a creationist,
Yes, there you go. Yeah.
actually. So he believes in the creation story, and his whole thing was debunking all of these scientists that were dating things, you know, a million years old or this many years old or whatever.
Yeah.
Because he would go and do things behind them and say, this doesn't make any sense, and here's why. Of course, you know, the communities put him down and painted him as being this crazy person just to, you know, take away any of his credibility, which is what happens to anybody that speaks truth. But
that's the same. That's Graham Hancock is almost like the secular version of him, because the same thing is happening to him.
oh,
That
interesting. Because he's saying
he's
things aren't old enough or
no,
or
not
too old.
actually. He's saying things are older than we're told. Essentially, the point you're getting at,
He's not aligning with the
the
mainstream.
mainstream. Exactly. So the point you're getting at, I completely agree with, is take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Like,
Take what we say with a grain of salt too. I mean, that's probably pretty clear.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, the way that especially mainstream science and history and archaeology and geology, like the way that everything is dated, you know, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a scientist here, but it doesn't always quite add up. So
Nope.
to me, I just take everything back to the word of God. And
Exactly.
you know, there are some God-fearing Christians who are scientists who do believe that there's a biblical argument for the earth being hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years old. And that comes from something called, this is kind of getting in a tangent, something called the gap theory, that between verses 1, Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's time that is not in there, that it's not accounted for. And I'm not really going to comment on that either way, other than I feel like it's kind of a stretch. And taking everything back to the word of God, it doesn't, we just don't know. We're not given the exact numbers. If you add up the genealogy of humans, we get about 6,000-ish years, but we just don't know for sure. And kind of like we've talked about in some of our past episodes, you know, Yahweh is a God of order and detail, and he's given us a lot of detail. And, you know, I feel like mainstream science, especially secular science, and this is part of what we're going to get into today, is one of the objectives is to try to devalue God's word and what he said and what he's done, and try to bring confusion into that. And you know, this goes for time as well, is the more things can become convoluted and people are trusting in science, then the less reason they have for a creator.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe one day we'll talk about dinosaurs and then we can really get into this. Because that conversation, which is very close knit to the evolution conversation,
Yeah.
goes right along hand in hand with that idea and the concept of taking Yahweh off of the throne as the creator and making it about other things. So,
Right.
anyway,
Exactly.
let's get back to Pharmakeia. So,
Yeah.
let's talk about this quote and the emblem of Western medicine being rooted in serpent worship.
Yeah.
Who do we think came up with this idea? It sounds to me like something a serpent himself would come up with, no?
Sounds like it.
You know, Satan is an imitator. He has created nothing, and he wants nothing more than to ruin God's beautiful creation. This is opinion, but what better way to do this than through Pharmakeia, aka sorcery, aka the evolution of that being modern day pharmaceuticals that give the promise of will fix your problem, but really create other problems that then put you into a cycle of sickness that don't actually heal you, which to me is exactly as they defined it, the healing arts. Why would you call it an art? Healing arts? Because it's not actually healing.
Well, kind of like they also say practicing medicine because it's just practice.
It's just practice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the thing. If the Lord created herbs and plants and animals and the sun and, positive, loving relationships to help heal us, it would only make sense to me that the enemy would attack those things.
Yeah.
Why use an herb or a plant to heal your body when someone can say, oh, here, just take this little pill, put it in front of you, and it's going to solve your problems? It's the illusion of healing right in front of us, when the truth is that pharmaceuticals, as they were designed, keep us entrapped in the medical system, dependent on it and in its cycle.
Yeah.
We're going to talk more about what I'm even talking about with this and what we were talking about with this as it relates to Western medicine and the roots of it next episode, because it's its own topic.
Yeah.
So please don't think I'm just being dramatic when I say these things. And also, please do not take what I'm saying as judgment or any sort of like, oh, you're taking a pharmaceutical, I'm judging you. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to point out the history of this so that we can all understand it together, and then we can all make decisions for our own health on what we're going to do.
Right. And history goes back thousands of years.
It does. It goes back and back and back. So let's go back. Let's talk about mythology. I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to miss how commonplace this was in other religions, what we would call pagan religions.
Yeah.
So just as this is a point to remind you guys, to remind you listeners, if you have not listened to episodes 3 through 6 of this podcast on spiritual warfare, you're going to want to go back and listen. In episode 4 and 5, we dove into Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, which is going to give you a lot more context into this topic. We don't want to rehash everything here. So definitely go listen to that. We're going to explain a little bit about it, but said briefly, this is a very quick summary.
Yeah.
The Greek, quote, gods or demigods or whatever you want to call them were likely not a myth. They were likely the offspring of the fallen angels as described in Genesis 6. They're also known as the Watchers or the Nephilim. These fallen angels mated with human women. And if we look at the story of one Greek, quote, god called Asclepius, we will see his father is Apollo and his mother was a mortal human. Sounds a little bit like the description of the Nephilim. So I'm actually going to read Genesis 6, verse 4. It states, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men renowned. Now, this is stated in other areas. We also, in the past episodes, mentioned this instance in an explanation in the book of Enoch, which corroborates a lot of this. So again, listen back.
Right.
But let's
And just to clarify real quick there, the Watchers, in reference to that verse you just read, were the sons of God, and the Nephilim
are their offspring.
their offspring of humans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
I combined it in the same sentence there.
yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to clarify after you reading that verse that the Watchers and the Nephilim are different entities, but technically the Watchers are the fallen angels or sons of God. So
thank you for the clarification. So who is Asclepius? in quote Greek mythology, aka likely a child of a fallen angel,
Right.
so likely Nephilim. He was the god of medicine, healing, rejuvenation, and physicians. In
Interesting.
depictions of Asclepius, he is shown with a staff with a coiled snake. And to the Greeks, snakes were sacred beings of wisdom, healing, and resurrection. Interesting that they would
Yes,
worship
very
a
interesting.
serpent.
Yeah.
So now let's keep going. Asclepius, he had children. His daughters were named Hygelia and Panacea. Hygelia was the goddess of health, cleanliness, and hygiene, as I'm sure you could probably get from the base of that word.
Heads
And
up.
Panacea was the goddess of universal health. She is typically portrayed with a potion which she used to heal the sick. And there is another image, the cup with the snake, that is known as the bowl of Hygeia. It is the symbol for pharmacy in most parts of the Western world where pharmacies are located. So a similar kind of word, that another word is used that a lot of people will use, is the mortal and pestle, is
Oh, yeah.
based in this Hygeia imagery that dates all the way back to these Greek quote demigoddesses or whatever they are. So if you look at the logo for like Walgreens pharmacy, or even the pharmacies at stores like Walmart and Rite Aid, the symbolism is still there. It's still
Right.
the
Yeah.
same symbol, just, they had to patent their own logos, so they had to change it around a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah.
But let's back up even further. Let's go back to Asclepius, whose father was Apollo, as I mentioned. Apollo's father was Zeus, and he had a brother named Hermes. And what is Hermes holding? The caduceus,
Oh,
which
here
is
we
the
go.
two snakes winding up the winged staff. It is said that Hermes was the god of commerce and market, also the god of thieves, and also the guide for the dead, because he was said to have traveled between worlds, the spiritual and physical. He was also known as Mercury to the Romans, I believe it was.
Right. Yeah.
So he's found holding the caduceus, and some refer to this as, it's also called the Azoth, and it is said to symbolize trade, negotiation, alchemy, and wisdom. So the whole point in mentioning this symbolism is to emphasize the roots of Pharmakeia and where it began, where it started off, and the fact that it's still very much the same today. The Bible tells us to stay away from sorcery, which
Yeah.
is also something the Nephilim are known for creating. In Galatians 5, verses 19 through 20, it says, the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions. But perhaps the most hard-hitting reference is in your favorite book of the Bible, Revelation 21,
Yeah.
verse 8. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, also referred to as sorcerers in some translations, the idolaters and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. So Yahweh does not take lightly to sorcery and witchcraft.
Yeah.
And my goal here is not to try to guilt trip you or make you feel bad or anyone. I'm just trying to say that I'm not trying to say that everyone involved in the medical industry is a sorcerer that's sitting around making magic potions. The reason we're talking about it is just to talk about it, to shed light on this conversation, because it needs to be had. The Lord, he didn't create our bodies haphazardly. He created them in his own image.
Yeah.
He didn't create, we're not lemons. He didn't create pieces of junk. We're created in the
Right.
image of God. So with this conversation, I just really want to challenge, and I think you do too, that this idea that we need sorcery made by man,
Right.
likely taught by the Nephilim, in order to heal our ailments. The Bible clearly says in Revelation that during the end times, all nations will be deceived by the whore of great Babylon with her sorceries. Sorcery is the Greek word for pharmakeia. And
Right.
pharmakeia is connected to administering drugs, poison, sorcery, the magic arts, deception, and to idolatry. So, what's going on in our world today? The medical
Mhm.
industry has really been deeply infiltrated and controlled by some evil sorcerers. Again, not everybody, but there are some
Yeah.
that are guided by the enemy, that are not guided by the Lord. But it is a tool that the enemy, as far as I can see, is using.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I'm kind of sticking out to me in this picture that we're painting is that this is not something that has just come about in the past 100 years.
Yes,
This
exactly.
has been woven into humanity for thousands and thousands of years. That's the whole reason we're going back to the Greeks and even the pre-flood world of the Nephilim, and why books like the Book of Enoch can be a useful resource because it references this, is where these sins of witchcraft started.
Yeah.
And through all of that, the enemy has been weaving his schemes, but Yahweh God is greater than all of these false gods. He's greater than the serpent of old, as Revelation describes him, Satan, and he's greater than the schemes of men today.
Mhm.
Because, like you said, not every one who works in the medical field is a sorcerer.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just we're trying to shine a little light on,
The history and
right, the history of where this stuff came from.
yeah,
It doesn't make every person who does anything with it bad, because the fact of the matter is herbs and natural substances can also be used for sorcery.
sure. A lot of things can be used for negative and for bad. The goal here is really just for us to kind of root out what is of God and what is not. And
Right.
again, I mentioned Dr. Bond earlier, but definitely stay tuned for his episodes because he gave me a new perspective and some new thoughts and ideas about this idea of partnering with God in our health and what that
Mhm.
looks like and what that means and how to trust him through things. And one thing that he shared with me that was really stand out was he said that we are so conditioned and trained to think that symptoms, when we have a headache, for example, we're trained because we have TV commercials
Right.
to go get a pain reliever, to go get, an NSAID pain reliever and like use it to get rid of the headache. But really, God is so smart and so wise that he created our bodies to experience pain. And that pain is an indicator that something is not in alignment. And instead of suppressing the symptom, when we get in alignment with God and our bodies, then we can get to the root cause of what's going on and we can solve the problem.
Right.
And a lot of this goes back to, like you mentioned, that this has been going on for thousands of years. It's thousands of years of conditioning. And I actually do think we
Mhm.
should do an episode on what it means to be conditioned or programmed.
Yeah.
I think, we've used that term a lot and most people probably know what that means, but it might be helpful to kind of understand how frequently this is done to us by our own GOV institutions. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying without me saying it out loud. But, the media. We are taught and controlled in certain ways, and this is one of those ways that for a very long time, especially anybody that's alive in this generation, has grown up with televisions, with commercials where pharmaceutical ads, a few of them in America at least, most especially, are allowed to run on air every 5 milliseconds.
Yeah.
This is how we've been conditioned to think. And if you see it enough and you hear it enough, then you believe it. So that's actually what we're going to talk about next episode is
Yeah.
Western medicine, how we got to where we are today. It's kind of the history of from, the late 1800s through the early 1900s as we
Mhm.
transition into this kind of new marketplace with drugs. And,
Yeah.
drugs are old, but they're new too. So I'm excited for us to talk about that. So definitely stay tuned. Rachel,
Yeah.
is there anything that you wanted to tie up in this episode?
No, I think that's a good place to transition us out for the, our first episode. We wanted to kind of scratch the surface. And then we decided we wanted to go back further and expound on some of those little things that we mentioned. And then our hope is to kind of weave this together with how this ain't, the ancient Pharmakeia developed into what we might recognize more in the past several hundred years.
Yeah.
And one thing I did want to say is, and you and I were talking about it before we were recording, is like you said, we're not here to give anyone any kind of medical advice or any ideas or judge anyone in any way whatsoever. All we really want to do is just kind of throw out some little nuggets out there so that people can dig in and do more of their own research and come to their own conclusions. There's so much information that even, we're touching on things that span thousands and thousands of years. And so putting all the pieces together takes a long time. It took, both of us a long time, and using resources that we've gotten from each other. So that can be really helpful when you're trying to make sense of these, just this one industry, and it's all encompassing. And like we'll discuss next episode, it touches a lot more than just the medical field. So
Yeah,
yeah, just
absolutely.
bear with us, and hopefully connect with something we say, or it puts some pieces together for you that you can pray on and look into more on your own.
Definitely. Yeah. Use your own discernment. As Rachel mentioned, it's taken us a lot of years. And
Yeah.
honestly, it's taken us a lot of our own painful experiences with the medical system to even look into this. If we didn't have
Right.
the negative experiences that we had, we may not be having this conversation. And I think that that is, that's honestly just as a kind of side note. Like when I see moms that already see birth for what it is and the truth about it and how industrialized it's become and it's their first baby, I am so proud. I can't even almost fathom it. I'm like, how did you figure this out?
Yeah.
Because it took me making the mistakes in order to get it figured out.
Right.
And so if you're one of those people that hasn't gotten, hasn't had a problem per se from the medical system, but you're still very curious about it, good for you.
Yeah.
Because it took learning the hard way for me, and I know for Rachel too, in a lot of different situations to get to where we are. But that's okay, right? We are living these lives, and our experiences are what shape us. So
Right.
we're all going to be in a different place. And I hope that this just gets you thinking and praying and using discernment, and look it up for yourself. Look into Greek mythology, look up the caduceus, and look for those images of the Greek and Roman gods and the serpent. So we are going to dive into Western medicine, roots of it and Mr. Rockefeller next week. So stay tuned. Join us if you want to know the history of how the heck we got to where we are today. And thank you for tuning in and being on this journey with us. If you'd like to follow along outside the podcast, join the mission, Instagram, Facebook, or on YouTube at The Radiant Mission. And if you're loving the show, we highly encourage you to share it with a friend. Share this with somebody that is into this stuff too. We'd really appreciate it. And today we're going to close with Ephesians 5, verses 8 through 16. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in God. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. And we're wishing you a radiant week. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.